The orchard was 11 trees. Everyone in Bracken County knew this, because everyone in Bracken County had an opinion about it, and opinions require a number to anchor themselves to. And 11 was a number easy to hold in the mouth when you were explaining to someone why a thing was insufficient. 11 trees on a north-facing slope above Ida Marsh's 22-acre parcel, the kind of slope that caught the morning shadow off the ridge and lost 2 hours of direct sun every day from October through March, which in apple-growing terms meant a slope that every serious orchardist in the county had looked at and passed on for 30 years. Ida Marsh had not passed on it. She had paid what the land was worth given its limitations, which was not much, and she had spent her first spring on the parcel not planting more trees, which was what the county expected, and not clearing the slope for other use, which was what a reasonable woman would have done, but reading. She was a reader in the specific way of people who read because they need information rather than because they enjoy the activity, which meant she read with a pencil and marked what was relevant and skipped what wasn't and came back to the relevant sections twice. She had 3 books about apple cultivation borrowed from the county lending library, and one she had purchased from a catalog, and she read all 4 through the winter before she moved to the parcel and again in the spring after she arrived, and what she was looking for was something specific that she had found reference to in the catalog book, a phenomenon she had not seen mentioned in the other 3, which was what made it interesting. The phenomenon was this: certain apple varieties exposed to a hard frost at the correct stage of ripening produced a transformation in their sugar content that no amount of careful summer management could replicate. The cold did something to the fruit that warmth could not undo and heat could not substitute for. The result was a flavor profile that was distinct from any apple grown in the standard manner, and that commanded, in the eastern markets where such things were understood, a price that was not in the same conversation as standard apple pricing. The county did not know this because the county grew apples on south-facing slopes in the conventional way and sold them at the conventional price, and had been doing so for long enough that the conventional way had acquired the authority of fact. Ida had moved to the parcel in March. She had the 11 trees and the north-facing slope and 4 books, and a specific idea about what the slope's limitations were actually for. If you are watching this from somewhere far from here, leave your city in the comments. I want to know how far a thing travels when it starts with 11 trees on the wrong side of a hill. The neighbor who introduced himself first was a man named Court Lyle, who ran the largest apple operation in Bracken County, 80 acres of south-facing orchard on the good land east of the road, and who had the pleasant, settled confidence of a man whose method had worked long enough that he had stopped examining whether a different method might work better. He came over the fence line on a Thursday in April, which was early enough in the season that the trees were still bare, and the slope looked like what it was: 11 small trees on a north-facing hillside that had been unmanaged for years and showed it. He looked at the trees, he looked at the slope. He looked at Ida, who was on a ladder against the closest tree with a pruning saw, removing a section of deadwood from the upper scaffold that had been left too long. He said, "You're keeping the north slope." She cut through the deadwood and came down the ladder and looked at him. She said, "I am." He said, "I ran 6 trees up there 10 years ago as an experiment. They produced, but the fruit was poor, small and too tart." She said, "What variety?" He said, "Roxbury russet." She said, "That's the wrong variety for a north-facing slope with late frost exposure." He looked at her. He had the look of a man receiving information that he was uncertain whether to classify as knowledge or opinion. He said, "What's the right variety?" She said, "That depends on what you want the frost to do to the fruit." He looked at the slope for a moment. Then he looked back at Ida. He said, "The frost doesn't do anything to fruit except damage it." She said, "That's one thing it does." She went back up the ladder. He stood at the base of it for a moment and then walked back toward his property. And Ida heard him go and did not watch him go because she was busy with the next section of deadwood, and the deadwood was the immediate problem. She wrote that evening in her notebook, which she kept on the kitchen table and added to most evenings. Lyle came over. He ran Roxbury russets on this slope 10 years ago. Wrong variety. Didn't understand the frost mechanism. She paused and then added, "He will come back when he understands what I'm producing." She did not write when that would be, because she didn't know yet, and she had a policy against writing things she didn't know. The varieties she had ordered were not varieties that Bracken County knew. She had found them through correspondence with an orchardist in Vermont who ran a small specialty operation and who had written back to her inquiry with the specific, spare manner of someone accustomed to being consulted by people who had read enough to ask the right questions. His name was Aldous Penn, and he knew frost ripening the way certain people know a tool they have used for 20 years, which is by the particular feel of it rather than by the description of it. He had told her in his first letter, "The North Slope is not a limitation. It is the mechanism. Without the shadow and the late frost exposure, the varieties I will recommend produce well, but not distinctively. On a slope like yours, they produce something that has no accurate comparison in standard orcharding." He had recommended 3 varieties. All 3 were sent as young grafted whips in early April, arriving in a crate that the post office in town had held for her, with the mildly skeptical attention of a postmaster who has received unusual packages for unusual people and has learned to reserve judgment. She planted them on the slope that week, working the soil carefully around each root system the way Penn's planting notes specified, firming each whip into the ground with the steady pressure of someone who understands that what she is doing now will not produce results for 3 years, and that the 3 years require the same quality of attention as the planting day. She watered them and staked them against the April wind and wrote in her notebook the planting date of each variety and its position on the slope and the soil conditions at planting and the expected first bearing year. The expected first bearing year for all 3 was 3 years out. The county would not know what she was doing for 3 years. She had accounted for this. The summer was the work of 2 operations running simultaneously, which was the 11 original trees that needed management if they were going to contribute to anything, and the 3 new varieties that needed to establish their root systems without producing, which required a different kind of attention than the bearing trees, quieter and less visible, the kind of tending that looks like doing nothing to someone who doesn't understand what establishment requires. She thinned the fruit on the original trees aggressively in June, which was a practice the county knew, but which she did differently than the county did it, leaving fewer fruit per tree and spacing them further apart on the scaffold branches, which reduced yield and increased size and concentrated the flavor in the fruit that remained. Her neighbor on the western side, a woman named Frances Cole who grew grain and kept a small kitchen garden and had no strong opinions about apple cultivation, watched her do this from across the fence one morning and said, "You're taking off a lot of fruit." Ida said, "I'm concentrating what's left." Frances said, "You could sell the ones you're taking off." Ida looked at what she'd just removed, undersized fruit that was not going to become anything worth selling, regardless of what she did with it now. She said, "Not for any price worth the effort." Frances looked at the tree, and at the fruit on the ground, and at Ida. She said, "You know what you're doing." It was not quite a question. Ida said, "I know what I'm aiming for. Whether I know what I'm doing will be clearer in the fall." Frances nodded, the nod of a woman who has been around farming long enough to understand the difference between those 2 things, and went back to her grain. The letter from Aldous Penn in July contained the specific instruction Ida had been waiting for since spring. It described the timing of the frost ripening process in detail she had not fully had before, the window in which the first hard frost needed to arrive to trigger the sugar conversion without damaging the flesh of the fruit, and the signs in the fruit itself that indicated it had reached the precise stage of maturity at which the frost would work, rather than simply harm. She read the letter twice, and then read the relevant sections 3 more times, and marked 4 passages with her pencil, and wrote the key timing information on a separate page in her notebook, the page she would carry with her in her coat pocket when October came. She wrote back to Penn with 2 questions about the original 11 trees, whose variety she had identified from the county records as a late-season heirloom type called Newtown pippin, which Penn confirmed in his response was theoretically suited to frost ripening, but which he had not personally worked with at the stage she was describing. He said, "Proceed carefully with the pippins. The new varieties will behave predictably. The pippins are unknown," she wrote. "Proceed carefully with pippins. Unknown behavior at frost." She underlined unknown behavior. The September that year was warm, which was bad for what she was planning, in the specific sense that a warm September meant a later first frost, which meant the fruit would be further into its ripeness cycle when the cold arrived, which meant the window Penn had described would be narrower than she wanted. She watched the weather the way farmers watch weather when something specific depends on it, which is with the full attention of someone whose plans cannot accommodate what the weather decides to do, but who needs to know what it is deciding as early as possible. She wrote the daily temperature in her notebook beside the daily fruit condition notes she had been keeping since August, a column of numbers that told her the story of the season in a language she was learning in real time, cross-referencing Penn's letters when the numbers suggested something she hadn't seen described. October arrived, and with it the change in the light that precedes the cold in that part of the country, the afternoons going from the thick gold of summer to something thinner and more honest, and the trees on the slope carrying their fruit in the specific fullness of apples that have had the full season and are ready, the Newtown pippin's green gold on the scaffold branches, and the new varieties not bearing yet but showing in their leaf color and branch structure the beginning of what they were going to be. She watched the pippins every morning. She watched the sky every evening. The first hard frost was forecast on a Wednesday in the second week of October, a night temperature that the county weather station predicted would reach 28 degrees by 4 in the morning, which was the lower end of the range Penn had specified as useful and the upper end of what he had specified as potentially damaging. She read the forecast and sat with it at the kitchen table for a while, and then wrote in her notebook, October 11th, hard frost forecast, 28 degrees. The window is narrow. She did not write what she was going to do, because what she was going to do was the only thing available to her, which was let the frost happen and observe the result and revise her understanding from what she found. She went to bed at the normal hour. She set no alarm. The frost came the way Penn had said it would come when it came correctly, which was as a stillness, the wind dropping out completely in the small hours so that the cold settled rather than moved, layering down through the air like something with weight until it reached the ground and the leaves and the fruit on the north-facing slope that had been positioned in exactly the right way to receive it. She woke at 5 and went out in the dark with a lantern and walked up the slope to the trees and held the lantern up to the closest pippin and looked at it. The fruit had frost on its surface, a fine, dry frost that caught the lantern light and held it, and beneath the frost, the skin of the apple had changed in a way she could see even in lamplight, a slight intensification of color at the stem end that Penn's letter had described as the first visible sign of the conversion. She stood at the tree for a long time. The hill was quiet in the specific way of cold mornings, when everything that moves has stopped moving, and the silence has a texture to it. She put her hand to the fruit and felt the cold of the skin and the firmness beneath it, and then she took one apple from the lowest scaffold and put it in her coat pocket and went back to the house. She cut it at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and looked at the flesh, which was cream-colored and dense, and she tasted it. She sat still for a moment. Penn had described the flavor in one of his letters as concentrated, by which he meant not sweet exactly, but rich, the way a thing is rich when the unnecessary parts of it have been removed, and what remains is only the essential character of the fruit itself. This was accurate. This was also, she understood immediately, something that would require no explanation to the right buyer. The right buyer would taste it and understand without being told. She wrote in her notebook, October 12th, Post-frost pippins. Flesh dense, cream, flavor concentrated, complex, nothing comparable in standard production. The conversion worked. She wrote that last sentence and looked at it for a while. Then she went to make coffee and start the day, because the fruit needed to come off the trees before the afternoon warmed enough to reverse what the night had done, and the morning was already beginning to lighten at the east window. She harvested the pippins that morning, working fast and careful in the cold, placing each apple in the lined crate she had prepared the previous week with a deliberateness that was not ceremony, but was close to it. The deliberateness of handling something that had taken 3 seasons of preparation and 1 precise night of cold to become what it was. 41 apples. The 11 trees had not produced heavily, which was partly the variety, and partly her aggressive thinning, and partly the North Slope's shorter season, and she had not expected heavy production. She had expected 40-odd apples of a specific quality, and she had them. She covered the crates and brought them into the root cellar, where the temperature was cold but steady, and she wrote the quantity in her notebook, and the harvest date, and the temperature at harvest, and closed the notebook and went in to wash her hands. The question of where to sell them was one she had been working on in parallel with the question of how to grow them, and the 2 questions had converged in August when Penn's July letter had arrived with a name appended at the bottom, almost as an afterthought, which was the name of a woman in Philadelphia who provisioned 3 of the city's better hotels with specialty food products and who Penn described in 1 sentence, "She knows what frost-ripened fruit is, and she will pay what it is worth." Ida had written to the woman, whose name was Beatrice Cord, in August. She had sent a description of the operation and the varieties and the slope conditions and the expected timing of the frost harvest, and had asked whether there was interest in a preliminary tasting arrangement for the current season's output. Beatrice Cord had written back in September, which was faster than Ida had expected, and her letter was 4 sentences. She said she was familiar with Penn's work. She said frost-ripened Newtown pippins were not available anywhere she currently sourced from. She said she would take whatever Ida had from the current season for a trial price she named, which was a price that Ida read twice and then set the letter down for a moment before she picked it up and read it again. It was not a price she had expected. It was a price that changed the arithmetic of the operation, not for the current season only, but for the operation as she had planned it across the years. And she sat with it and adjusted the numbers in her head and then got out her notebook and adjusted them on paper and looked at what the adjusted numbers said, which was that 11 trees on a north-facing slope with the right varieties and the right frost management, at the price Beatrice Cord was offering, produced a different kind of farm than 40 acres of conventional orchard on the south-facing good land across the road. She wrote Cord's price in the notebook, and beside it wrote, "This changes the calculation." She packed 20 of the 41 pippins in a crate with the care she would have taken packing something irreplaceable and shipped them to Philadelphia on a Friday in the 3rd week of October, 3 days after the frost. She kept 21. Cord's response arrived by telegraph, which told Ida the response was urgent in the way that only very good news or very bad news is urgent. It said, "These are exceptional. Send the remainder of the season's harvest at the same grade. Confirm your spring planting plans." She sent the remaining 21 that afternoon and wrote back about the spring planting plans, which she had been refining since August, and which involved the addition of 3 more of the frost-responsive varieties Penn had originally recommended, and which she now had both the reason and the resources to pursue. Court Lyle came over the fence again in November, which she had expected, because the county talked and Lyle paid attention to what the county talked about. He found her on the slope doing the post-harvest pruning, which is the pruning that shapes the tree for the following year's production, and which she was doing with the reference Penn had sent her in his October letter, propped open on the top rail of the ladder. He stood at the base of the slope and looked up at her and said, "I heard you got a telegraph from Philadelphia." She came down the ladder. She said, "Word travels." He said, "In this county it does." He looked at the trees, which in their post-harvest state looked exactly as unremarkable as they had looked in April. Small trees on a shaded slope with bare branches and the beginning of the dormancy that would hold them until spring. He said, "The price you got, per apple," she told him. He was quiet for a long enough time that she could hear the wind working the ridge above them. He said, "Per apple." "Per apple," she said. He looked at the trees again. He looked at the slope and the shadow line on it, where the ridge cut off the direct sun and the specific angle of the light on the north face. He said, "I had it backwards." She said, "Most people do." He said, "The limitation is the mechanism." She had said that in different words in April, and he had walked away from it, and she noted that he had come back to it himself, which was the correct direction of travel, and she said, "The frost does something that warmth can't do." The slope is what puts the trees in the frost's way at the right moment. He looked at the slope for a long time. He said, "I have 8 acres on my north boundary that I've never planted, too much shadow to run the standard varieties at competitive yield." He looked at her. "Would you be willing to talk about it?" she said. "Penn's the one to talk to about the varieties. I can give you his address." He said, "I meant talk to you." She considered this. She said, "I'll talk to you about what I know, which is one season's experience with one slope and one variety. Penn knows 20 years of this." Lyle said, 20 years of this in Vermont. You know this specific hill country." She acknowledged that. She said, "Come in the spring, when the new varieties are in the ground. By then, I'll have a second season's plan that's worth discussing." He nodded. He walked back to his property, and she went back up the ladder and resumed the pruning and thought about the 8 acres on Lyle's north boundary and what they might become in 3 years under the right management. And then she set that thought aside because it was 3 years away and the pruning was now. Francis Cole came over the following week, not to discuss the orchard, but because Francis was the kind of neighbor who came over when things happened, good or bad, and brought something practical when she came, which in this case was a jar of pickled beets from her own kitchen, and a single question delivered without preamble. The telegraph from Philadelphia. Was it as good as it sounded? Ida set the pickled beets on the kitchen table and said, "It was." Francis sat down. She said, "I didn't understand what you were doing up there all summer, with the thinning and the watching and the not picking until the frost." She looked at her hands. "I think I understand it now." Ida made coffee. She said, "The frost isn't the problem. It's the point." Francis said, "That's a hard thing to believe when you've been farming around frost for 30 years. Ida set the coffee down. She said, "It was a hard thing to believe when I was reading it. It was different when I tasted the fruit." Francis drank her coffee and looked out the window at the slope where the 11 trees stood bare and dormant in the November light. She said, "What does it taste like?" Ida thought about the morning of the 12th of October, the kitchen table, the lamp turned up, the fruit cut open, the flesh cream-colored and dense. She said, "Like what the apple was always supposed to be." Francis was quiet. Then she said, "Will you need help next season when you have more trees bearing?" Ida had been thinking about this since September. She said, "Not next season. The season after that, when the new varieties come into production. I'll need someone who understands the harvest timing and won't rush it." Francis said, "I'm not doing anything in October that couldn't wait." Ida looked at her. She said, "I pay fair wages for fair work." Francis said, "I know you do." It was a simple exchange, and it settled something that would be useful in 2 years, which was exactly when it needed to be settled, and neither of them made more of it than that. The winter was quiet, the way winters are quiet when the external work is finished, and the internal work is the kind that doesn't make noise. Ida corresponded with Penn through December and January, refining the planting plan for the spring, and corresponded with Beatrice Cord in Philadelphia about the following season's expected output, which she stated in honest terms, which were that the new varieties would not bear for 2 years, and that the pippin crop in the second year would be larger than the first but not dramatically so. Cord wrote back, "I will take everything you produce for the next 3 seasons at the trial price to establish the relationship. Ida read that sentence twice. She wrote, "Cord has committed 3 seasons. The relationship is established." She looked at what she had written, and then she got out her planning notebook, a separate book from the daily record, and she opened it to the page where she had drawn the slope in rough, marking the position of each existing tree and the intended position of each new planting. And she looked at the drawing and thought about what the slope would look like in 3 years, which was when the new varieties came into production, and when Francis Cole would be needed in October, and when the conversation with Court Lyle about his 8 north-facing acres might have become the conversation she was currently not ready to have. She looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she added 3 more positions to the planting plan, varieties she had discussed with Penn in December, and that he had confirmed were suited to the slope. A slower introduction than she had originally planned, but a more certain one. She labeled each position and folded the drawing and put it in the envelope with Penn's most recent letter and her response, and went to seal it. Outside, the January light was the flat, uncommitted light of a month that has not yet decided to become February, and the slope was bare and still, and carrying its 11 trees in the dormant way of things that are not doing anything visible but are not doing nothing, which was the way the slope had been carrying those trees for years before Ida arrived, and the way it would carry them long after, patient and particular and fully prepared for the frost that would come again in October and do what it did, and give the fruit what only the cold could give it, which was the one thing warmth could never substitute for, which was the concentrated truth of what the thing actually was. Spring came in the 2nd week of March, not dramatically, but with the particular insistence of a season that has been waiting its turn and does not intend to wait longer. The ground on the slope softened from the center out, the frost working its way back through the soil in the way Ida had already learned to read by the darkening of the surface color and the slight give underfoot that told her when the root zone was ready for work. She planted the new varieties in the last week of March, 4 additional whips from Penn, alongside the 3 already established, working each one into the prepared soil with the same care she had given the previous spring's planting, and staking them, and recording each position and condition in the notebook with the date. She had 7 young trees establishing now alongside the 11 bearing trees, and the bearing trees had come through the winter in the condition Penn had said they would come through it, which was good. The pruning she had done in November, shaping the scaffold branches for the coming season, in a way she could see already in the early April buds. The buds on the pippins came later than the conventional varieties on Lyle's south-facing acres across the road. She noted the date each year, the day the bud break became visible on the pippins, which was a week to 10 days behind the standard timing, which was not a failure of the variety but a characteristic of the north slope that delayed the developmental clock and put the fruit on a different schedule than everything else in the county. Different schedule, different frost window, different outcome. Lyle came in April as she had told him to, on a morning when she was on the slope checking the new plantings. He walked up the hill without ceremony and stood beside her and looked at the whips and at the bearing trees and at the buds just beginning to break on the pippins. He said, "Later than mine." She said, "Yes." He said, "By design." She said, "By slope." He looked at the ridge above them, at the shadow line it threw across the north face in the morning hours. He said, "My 8 acres get that same shadow until 10 o'clock." She said, "Penn will tell you what that means for variety selection." "I can tell you what I've seen in one season." He said, "Tell me what you've seen in one season." She told him. She told him about the frost window and the timing, and the pippin harvest, and the flavor, and the Philadelphia correspondence, and the price per apple, and the 3-season commitment. She told it in the plain, sequential manner she used for everything she understood well, without dramatics and without emphasis, because the facts were emphatic enough on their own, and anything added to them would have been a kind of dishonesty. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. He said, "You knew all of this before you bought the parcel." She said, "I knew it from the books. I didn't know it from the work until October." He said, "There's a difference." She said, "There's a significant difference." He looked at the pippin trees. He said, "I'll write to Pen." She said, "Tell him what your 8 acres get for sun hours by month, and what the ridgeline does to the frost pattern. He'll know what you need from that." Lyle nodded. He went back to his property. She went back to checking the new plantings, pressing the soil gently around each stake where the wind had shifted it, recording each condition in her notebook. Entry for April 14th. New plantings all showing establishment. Root zone firm. No movement at base. She had learned in the previous year that the difference between a well-planted whip and a poorly planted one showed at the base of the stake in exactly this way, which was either the slight looseness, that meant the root system was working against the surrounding soil rather than into it, or the firm stillness, that meant the roots had begun to accept the ground. These had the firm stillness. Good. The summer of the second year was different from the first, in the way that second years are different when the first year has given you a foundation of observation to build from. She knew the trees now, in the specific way that comes from watching things through a full cycle. She knew which scaffold branches needed attention early, and which would develop correctly without intervention. And she knew the timing of the fruit set on the pippins, and what it told her about the expected harvest window. And she knew how to read the early signs of pest pressure in time to address it before it became a loss. She addressed 2 problems that summer that she would not have caught in the first year. A fungal issue on the lower scaffold of the oldest pippin that she identified from the leaf margin discoloration Pen had described in his October letter, and a borer infestation on one of the new whips that she found during her weekly inspection of the establishment plantings. Both were managed. Neither became significant. She wrote them in the notebook as identified early, treated, resolved, which was the notebook's compressed version of 3 weeks of careful observation and 1 urgent letter to Pen and 1 change to the inspection schedule that she would maintain from then on. Francis Cole came by in September to understand the harvest timing, which was why Ida had told her to come in September, because the October harvest required someone who understood what they were looking for, and September was when there was enough time to explain it. They walked the slope together, and Ida described what the fruit would look like in the days before the frost, and what the frost needed to do to it, and how to tell the difference between a frost that had done what was needed and one that had gone too far. Frances listened with the focused attention of a woman who has decided that this is worth learning and has turned her full capacity for learning on it. She asked 4 questions, all of them precise, and Ida answered all 4, and then said, "The most important thing is the timing of the pick after the frost. Pen says 6 hours minimum. More than 24 and you've lost the optimal window." Frances wrote this down, which Ida noted and appreciated. A person who writes things down when they are being taught something is a different kind of help than one who doesn't. October came again. The forecast on the 9th was for a hard frost the night of the 13th, a deeper cold than the previous year, the kind of forecast that in a conventional orchard would mean emergency measures and loss calculations. Ida read the forecast and checked the fruit condition and compared it to Pen's timing description and wrote in her notebook, October 9th, frost forecast 13th, fruit at correct maturity stage, window aligned. She sent a note to Frances. Frances arrived at the farm at 5 in the morning on the 14th, 2 hours before full light, with a lantern and work gloves and the unhurried readiness of someone who understood that the work was going to take as long as it took and had organized her morning accordingly. They went up the slope together. The frost had settled as the forecast had promised, a deep, dry cold that had come down off the ridge in the still hours and layered over the slope the way Pen had described it coming when it came correctly. Ida held her lantern to the pippins first. The color at the stem end had shifted the way it had shifted the previous year, but more pronounced, because the frost had been harder and the fruit had been at a more advanced maturity stage, and the combination of those 2 things had produced exactly what Pen had predicted would happen in a second-year harvest with correctly timed fruit and adequate cold. She looked at the fruit for a moment. She looked at Frances, who was holding her lantern to a different tree and looking at the fruit with the careful attention of someone seeing a thing for the first time and trying to understand it against what they had been told to expect. Frances said, "The color change. This is it." Ida said, "That's it." Frances looked at the fruit for another moment. She said, "How do you know it's enough and not too much?" Ida showed her. She put her hand to the fruit and demonstrated the firmness she was feeling for, the specific give that was neither too hard nor too soft. And Frances put her own hand to the apple and felt it and nodded with the nod of a person whose hands have been educated in something new. They harvested through the morning, the two of them working the scaffold branches carefully from the outside in, placing each apple in the lined crates with the deliberateness the fruit required, not rushing and not talking much, because the work spoke for itself, and talking alongside it would have been a kind of distraction from the quality of the silence. By mid-morning they had 94 apples from the pippin trees, which was more than twice the previous year's harvest, and the quality was visible even without tasting. The skin had the particular deep gold of frost-ripened Newtown pippins at their correct moment, and the crates smelled of the concentrated sweetness that no amount of summer sun could produce, which was the smell of cold and time working on fruit that had been positioned correctly to receive them. Ida set the last crate in the root cellar and stood at the door for a moment. Frances was behind her. Ida said, "The new varieties won't bear until next season." Frances said, "I know." Ida said, "Next October, there will be more than two of us can harvest in a morning." Frances said, "Then we'll need to start earlier." She went home, and Ida went into the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table and wrote in her notebook, October 14th, second season, 94 pippins, quality higher than year one. Frances Cole's harvest capability confirmed, new varieties established, bearing next season. She set the pen down and looked at what she had written, and thought about the parcel as it had been when she arrived, the 11 trees and the shaded slope and the county's easy consensus that the north face was the wrong place for an orchard, and would always be the wrong place for an orchard. She thought about Lyle's 8 acres, for which he had now received Penn's recommendations, and which she had seen him beginning to prepare in August, the soil work of a man who has decided to commit to a 3-year process and is starting from the correct end of it. She thought about Frances arriving before light, with a lantern and work gloves, and no requirement for explanation. She thought about Beatrice Cord in Philadelphia, who had telegraphed back within a day, and had committed 3 seasons before she had any reason to accept the taste of 20 Newtown pippins that had spent one specific night on a north-facing hill in a county that had been growing apples for 30 years and had never produced anything worth a telegraph. She wrote one more line in the notebook before she closed it. The frost is not the problem. The slope is not the problem. The problem, everywhere she had seen it, was that people had decided what a limitation was before they understood what a limitation was for. She closed the notebook. The apple crates were in the root cellar, and October was doing what October did in the hill country, going gold and cold by turns, and the slope above the house held its 11 mature trees and its 7 establishing whips in the dormant patience of things that had been placed correctly and were doing what correctly placed things do, which was wait for the conditions that would make them what they were intended to be. She went to write to Beatrice Cord. The letter she wrote described the harvest in the same plain manner she described everything. 94 pippins. Higher quality than year one. New varieties bearing next season. Expected production between 140 and 160 units of comparable or superior grade. She named the price she wanted, which was above the trial price Cord had offered, and which she had calculated against the 3-season commitment and the demonstrated demand, and the fact that Cord had telegraphed rather than written, which was the move of a buyer who knows what she has found and does not want to risk the interval a letter requires. She sealed the letter and walked it to the post office herself, and came back and started the afternoon work, which was the pruning, because the pippins came off the trees and the pruning began, and the cycle turned the way the cycle always turned, from harvest to preparation, from this season to the next, from what had been accomplished to what needed doing before anything else would be possible. That was the work. It was always the work. Not the moment of the frost, or the morning of the harvest, or the telegraph from Philadelphia. Those were the evidence. The work was everything before them and everything after, the daily attention that the slope and the trees and the fruit required, paid without announcement in the early mornings and late evenings of a season that most of the county was spending on its south-facing acres, growing apples that would sell at the price apples had always sold for, because they were apples grown the way apples had always been grown, because nobody had thought to ask what a north-facing slope in a hard frost county was actually for. Cord's response came not by telegraph this time, but by letter, which arrived in the last week of October, and which Ida read at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, with her coffee going cold beside her, the way coffee goes cold when the thing you are reading requires more attention than the coffee. The letter was longer than any previous correspondence from Cord, 3 pages in a neat, businesslike hand, and it described something that Ida had not anticipated and had not planned for, and which required a full reading and then a second reading before she understood the shape of it. Cord had been in correspondence with 2 other hotel provisioners in New York and Boston who had heard about the Bracken County pippins through a buyer they shared, and both had expressed interest in establishing their own supply relationship directly. She was not passing on their names as a competitive threat, but as an indication of a market condition that Ida should understand before the new varieties came into production and before her operations scale became visible to a wider range of buyers. The condition was this: frost-ripened specialty apples of the grade Ida was producing did not exist at scale anywhere in the country that Cord knew of. What Ida had was not a small premium product in a niche market. It was the only product of its kind in a market that had not yet learned it wanted it, which was a different and more significant position than a premium product in an established niche, and which required a different kind of strategic thinking about how to grow without losing the quality that made the thing what it was. Cord had a proposal. She would continue as Ida's primary buyer. She would also facilitate introductions to the 2 other provisioners on terms that Ida controlled, meaning Ida set her own prices and her own volume commitments, and Cord took nothing from the arrangement except the relationship benefits of being the party who had found the producer first and who had the longest standing agreement. She said, in the letter's final paragraph, "I am telling you this because I believe you should know the full picture. You have something. I want you to know how rare that is so you can make decisions that protect it." Ida read that paragraph 3 times. She set the letter down and looked out the window at the slope, which was bare now in the November light, the harvest done and the pruning begun, and the trees carrying the shape of what they would be next season in the bare scaffold branches, that she could read the way she read the fruit in October, as information about what was coming rather than what was already here. She thought about what Cord had written, about the 2 provisioners in New York and Boston, about scale and quality and the relationship between them, which was always a relationship that required managing because the thing that made a product rare was always, eventually, at odds with the thing that made it larger. Penn had said something about this in a letter from the previous winter, a sentence she had marked and returned to. The reputation of the product is built by the work you cannot see. The moment the invisible work becomes visible, it is already in danger. She had not fully understood it when she read it. She understood it now. She wrote back to Cord that week. Her letter was also 3 pages, which was longer than she usually wrote because the thing she was describing required the length. She told Cord what she intended to do with the new varieties, and with Lyle's 8 acres when they came into production, and with the 3 additional years of expansion she had planned from the planting schedule she and Penn had developed. She told her the volume each of those years would produce, and the grade she intended to maintain, and the reason the grade would be maintained, which was the slope and the frost management and the harvest timing, none of which changed as the production grew because all of it was structural rather than dependent on the effort of a specific day. She said she would meet the two provisioners Cord mentioned, on her own terms, in the spring, when she had the next season's planting completed and a clearer picture of the production curve. She said she was not in a hurry. She said that was by design. She sealed the letter and walked it to the post office and came back and stood for a moment at the foot of the slope, looking up at the 11 mature trees and the 7 establishing whips in the November light, which was the flat, undecided light of a month between seasons. And she thought about the afternoon she had driven up to the parcel for the first time, and stood at this same fence line and looked at the same slope, and understood, before she bought anything, that what the county called a limitation was the specific condition the thing required. The county still called it a limitation. The difference was that now there was a telegraph from Philadelphia and a letter with 3 pages and 2 buyers in New York and Boston, and Court Lyle digging his 8 north-facing acres, and Francis Cole arriving before light with gloves and a lantern, and 94 Newtown pippins in the root cellar at a price that changed the arithmetic of what 22 acres on a north-facing slope could be. She went back into the house and got her notebook and her coat and walked up the slope in the November afternoon and did the pruning on the next tree in the sequence, the 3rd pippin from the top, working each scaffold branch with the care and attention of someone who understands that what she is doing today will determine what the tree becomes in April, which will determine what the fruit becomes in September, which will determine what the frost will have to work with in October, the whole chain running from this moment in November, backward and forward simultaneously, each link in it made of the same material, which was the daily work of paying attention to what was actually there, rather than what was convenient or familiar, or what the county had decided, 30 years ago and without sufficient curiosity, that a north-facing slope was good for. Nothing, they had said. It was good for nothing. She made the cut on the 3rd scaffold and moved to the 4th, and the November light moved with her across the slope, the way light moves on clear days in that season, thin and particular and honest about what it was and what it was not, which was not the rich warmth of summer and not the complete darkness of winter, but exactly what it was. The light of a month that was finishing one thing and preparing for the next, holding both states at once the way the slope held both its history and its future, in the same bare trees, on the same north-facing hillside, patient and specific, and already, in the way of things that have been placed correctly and know it, preparing for October.